And we talked about spiritual freedom, being free from the way the past influences the present, and being free for doing, loving other people. So that's a quick recap of last week. And this week what I want to do is try to apply some of those principles to 3 of the exercises from the second week. The 2 standards, the 3 types of persons, and the 3 degrees of humility. So that's sort of what we're going to talk about this evening. All right. So the 2 standards, it's a cosmic confrontation that Ignatius paints a picture of. Our identity is a choice, a decision encompassing conversion and rebirth is always necessary. And rebirths are always painful. Each birth means a death to our false self. And the birth is the life of our true self coming into being. Ignatius proposes 2 mentalities that are reduced to a central confrontation, good and evil. And that our interior life is charged with these opposing currents. And I just want to show you a little something on the board here. When Ignatius lived, they had an Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology, the way they looked at the universe. And that the earth is at the center. And the moon, as it really does, revolves at the earth. And the sun would revolve around the earth too. But they also thought that there were angels and demons in this called the sublunary universe. And Ignatius's big insight is that these angels and demons somehow influence our interior life, our insides. That it's charged with these opposing currents. And we're in the midst of this cosmic battle of good versus evil. So the grace of the 2 standards is asked for light and courage. The light is to recognize the strategy of Christ and the strategy of what Ignatius calls the enemy of our human nature, or the devil, or the dark spirit. It's a grace of the intellect. So you remember in the exercise you had affective graces, you can move to tears, feelings. This is really a grace of your intellect, of the mind. And the second one is courage, which provides the fire for the enlightenment that comes from the intellectual grace. It's the courage to act upon the insight when you get the insight. The meditation on the 2 standards is intended to provide deeper knowledge of God and Satan and their tactics. It encourages us to become familiar with the deceits of the enemy and learn to recognize Satan by the trail of evil marking his course. The essence of the meditation is personal. How do I experience the 2 standards? So that's the important key part. How does the individual see, how does the enemy try and tempt and trick me? How does the enemy of my human nature put in patterns of deceit to try and fool me? Hi, Tom.
Hi.
We just got started a little bit ago.
Well, that's a good thing. I'll go over here.
All right.
Oh, good. Excuse me. I have to take some right now.
Okay. So what is the strategy of, so the other flip side, other than the enemy of our human nature, is what is the strategy of Christ in my life, trying to redeem me and save me? How's Christ laboring to bring new life to my true self, to birth that true self into the world? How does the good spirit enliven me? How is God freeing me from the bondage of sin? And what is my pattern of grace and light? So the whole idea of the 2 standards is to personalize it. So you see how in your interior world, you're tempted by or you're invited by Christ. You're tempted by the enemy of our human nature, or you're invited by Christ into redemption, wholeness, and the fullness of your humanity.
So we're all on the same side.
Well, that'd be great. So it's very personal, the meditation on the two standards. Even though it's a cosmic battle, Ignatius wants us to bring it down to our own individual world and our own individual life, so that we know how the dark spirit tempts us and how the spirit of light is inviting us to bring about that true self. So the standard of Satan is completely self-focused and turned away from God. It refers to our propensity to be somebody on our own, to take over and run our own lives rather than God, allowing God to run our life. It's conviction that we are the meaning and the animating spirit of our own life. It seeks to corrupt our heart to see the self, or our false self, as the center of everything. We serve ourselves, not Christ. And Satan's purpose is to enslave us, to turn us in on our false selves, make us self-centered, and get us involved with our own egotisms. The evil one has the intention to reduce us to slavery and prevent us from actualizing our true self. Now, the strategy of Satan is to tempt, Ignatius says, to riches, honor, and pride, all of which turn us in on ourselves and stifle the true self. The strategy of the evil one is to keep you focused on yourself so that you cannot freely surrender to God in the activation of your true self. Two ways that the enemy confronts us: threatening us like a weak tyrant, or forcefully and directly like a general. In both cases, what the dark spirit tries to do is to attack our vulnerabilities and to hook us where we're weak. The effects of the evil one: when the evil one wins, we become preoccupied with our false self and the disorders within us. It wants us to turn us in on ourselves to the extent we become enslaved and become a destructive force in the universe. Now, for the good news. That is definitely the bad news. The good news is the standard of Christ. Standard of Christ is the way of the beloved. It's the way of Jesus, born out of the true self and made manifest in service to others. Standard of Christ is the ultimate meaning in our lives. It invites us to imitate Christ by desiring poverty, contempt of others, and humility. Christ first invites us to what we talked about last week, which is our spiritual poverty. That's the first invitation of the standard in Christ. Remember, our spiritual poverty is rooted in the nature of our human condition, that we're completely dependent on Christ, and we're an emptiness longing to be fulfilled by Christ. Christ's way is to embrace this dependent vulnerability. It is the awareness that all is gift, as key to understanding the poverty of spirit made possible only in and through God's love. Christ attracts us to the highest spiritual poverty. This is a great grace insofar as Christ activates the true self through our total dependence upon God. Now, actual poverty is a test of the genuineness of our spiritual poverty. And even desiring actual poverty is a grace. But the idea is not just to be poor. It's the idea that poor, you're more dependent upon Jesus. The strategy of Christ. It's usually counterculture and counter to many of the attractions of our heart. Embracing the strategy of Christ involves discovering, activating, and living out of our true selves. It means remaining focused on the greater glory of God. Choosing and acting out of the true self embodies the standard of Christ insofar as it reveals God's love in the world. Ignatius states that the strategy of Christ has 3 steps. First, poverty as opposed to riches. Second, insults and contempt as opposed to honor. And humility as opposed to pride. So followers of Christ's standard are called to desire poverty, insults and contempt, and humility.
That's the good news.
That's the good news. But as we'll find as we go through this, that it is good news, because those things only come about when we're intimately connected and involved in Christ and in love with Christ, and as Christ fills our being. I mean, you two have lived long enough to know that life brings you insults, contempt, and difficult times in your life.
Right.
And that's when the dependency comes. So Ignatius suggests that that might be a pathway to God.
I think that's, when I read that Paul saying, when I am weak is when I am strong, that kind of, for me, fits exactly this.
Mm-hmm.
Be willing to give of yourself, just allow yourself to be guided by God. Then, in a sense, you're weak, but you will be strong.
Absolutely.
When-
Yeah, the paradox in that, an emptiness to be filled, weak so that you're strong. It's all to breed this dependency upon God. They're just metaphors so that we can understand that the end game is to depend upon God. So Christ's strategy calls us to our true self. It's to enhance our freedom so that we can become a source of love in the world. It encourages a poverty of spirit, meekness, gentleness, and kindness, all of which are graces from God. So that's the two standards. Do you have any comments, reflections, or questions? Oh, Tom, you already had one.
But in life,
Mm-hmm.
is there like cycles that can... I don't know the question I want to ask.
Well, it's countercultural.
No, it seems like that there's moments that there's times in my life or cycles in my life where I can aspire to all that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other times where it's hard to go there. Is that normal, or am I not understanding?
No, I
this?
think that is normal, and I think you'll find that pulled apart a little bit more when we talk about the 3 degrees of humility, because there are different seasons in our lives where we encounter different realities, and so how Christ is moving in us at those times is different, and so the intimacy breeds a different way of being depending on which season of life we're in. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but I find that with myself, it's almost, it's like a cycle or something. It's like sometimes it's, and it, maybe it's to my fault too. That sometimes it seems like it's easy to desire that, to want that, to work towards that, and other times it's just very hard. It's, and I don't know if it's that it's where I am in my prayer life at that point in time, or I just don't, and I'm going to give you an example, going back to what I told you previously.
Mm-hmm.
When I came off that weekend,
Mm-hmm.
years ago, it was, my prayer life was wonderful, it was like the honeymoon. It was constant.
It's a great metaphor.
But I haven't had that in a long, long time. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes I feel like I'm always present to Christ. and other times I'm busy about many things,
Mhm.
and I'm not present. So I guess my question is that normal in life, or is it lack of effort on my part?
No, it's definitely not lack of effort on your part. I think it's really the human condition. And until, you know, the mystics, like Ignatius himself, grow in abiding intimacy with God, that is that spiritual union. In that situation, which is the goal of the true self, to be in that abiding union with God. But in that situation, God, our focus is always on God. But that's a developmental process to get there. So in that process, there's ebbs and flows. There's like, you got a taste of it after that Cursillo, huh?
Yeah.
That is really a spiritual high. I remember I did a Cursillo once myself. But yeah, I think as we progress, the graces become more subtle. And it's up to us to be open to really tasting and feeling and seeing.
And I have to say, is after I did the exercises, I felt that way too.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't to the extent that it was after I had made that weekend.
Right.
I mean, I was grateful that I found the exercises. This was wonderful. This was, you know, I felt like I was back. But then, but like you said, it's just, you know, and it fades and it fades, and you just try to build it up, and it fades and it fades.
Right.
And it's a constant effort. So does anybody, I mean, somebody who has a regular spiritual life, do they ever get to the point where Ignatius did? I mean, is it that common, or is it not that common?
I don't think it's that common to get into that complete abiding union.
So that's the frustration, because there's, like I said, there's those moments where you just want to stay in that place,
right?
Because you feel God's presence, and then
yeah, it's a struggle, I know.
okay. Good. If you say it's a struggle,
It is,
then that makes me feel better.
It's definitely a struggle. I mean, when you read the lives of the saints, you read Teresa of Avila. She was crazy for 25 years before she found that place where she was united with Christ. And Ignatius, he didn't come to it overnight. I mean, it took him a long time and a long journey to get there. And I think that's it with all of us. I mean, all we can do is keep coming before God in prayer and opening our hearts to be transformed and redeemed and healed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Because it's really, sometimes it is the desolation and consolation periods that happen in your life, and they come along, you know. And so, depending on how you are in the overall, it seems to me that you wind up being more open to God, more open to the Spirit. And there's other times when you get so busy with other things. I mean, it's, as you say, it's just living your life. And you get so busy, there's all these other things demanding your attention. And in a sense, you are being drawn, maybe that's the devil, drawing you away from God in a subtle way, you know. Oh, I'm so busy. I mean, you know, and even, I even read about that, is that, you know, you suddenly find, oh, I'm kind of busy, so my prayer life is normally 30 minutes, and a day I take a break for 30, well, maybe I'll make it 25. Maybe I'll kind of shorten, and then it gets shorter and shorter. Now all of a sudden you're feeling to yourself, well, where's God in my life? Well, it's because I walked away.
Right. Became lax in your prayer life.
That's true.
Yeah. And sometimes life just overwhelms us too.
Yeah. Then you think, when you're working with other people, and you sometimes, when you put into it what you put into it, and what so many of us do, you think to yourself, boy, how can anybody that doesn't bother, where could they possibly be?
Right.
I was at a meeting today, and we were talking about how do we get the parents of the children that we teach to be more interested in being parents that want to share God with their children. And simple things like praying before meals, talking about God in their life. And, in this particular age, in this particular area, so many parents have sort of think that, well, I'm taking care of what I need to take care of, dropping the kids off for religious ed.
Right.
And that's not it.
No. It's a call to the vocation of Christian parenthood, really.
Right.
It is a challenge in this day and age, too. People get pulled in so many different directions.
It is.
It's hard.
Really, really, really difficult. Especially when they're raising children. But when you have children, it doesn't matter what age they are. As long as they're alive, they're 50 years old and they're still your child.
I'll take your word for that.
Believe me.
I do believe you.
Never ends.
We were just talking about that before you came in, too.
Somebody, my brother-in-law told me that one of his friends said, somebody asked him, well, when does it end, And they said, when they put the last nail in your coffin.
Oh, jeez. Yeah. Well, you were going to say something else?
No, I just said
okay.
that telephone call that I had to run out to was one of them.
Oh, was it? No rest for the weary. Well, a couple principles I want to go through before we move on to the three types of persons. I told Catherine Ann what we're going to cover here tonight is the two standards, the three types of persons, and the 3 degrees of humility, and try and integrate how the things we talked about last week, especially how the true self fits into the Ignatian paradigm of things. So you're probably familiar with the Ignatian term, the magis, ad majorem Dei gloriam, the greater glory of God. Ignatius defines the magis as to choose that which is more to the glory of the divine majesty and his salvation of our soul. So listen to that. It's not only the glory to God, but it has to do with our salvation at the same time. Or in our terms and language, you can say, for the greater glory of God and for the activation of the true self. So the magis is choosing the better, the more in our life. And it's unique. It's a unique call and role in God's glory and God's love. It can be translated as the more, but it's not like more as in number. It's more as in deeper or more real. Or the better. Choosing and acting in accordance with God's love and is the glory of God activating the true self. So the magis becomes an important principle as we look at these next two exercises, because that's what Ignatius is developing, moving us towards, is the ability, the capacity to discern what is for the greater glory of God and what's for the salvation of our soul, or what's for the activation of our true self. The second category is indifference, and we'll see how indifference plays a role. Do you remember that from the exercises, the idea of indifference? It's been a while. Well, indifference is sort of like the freedom that we talked about before. It actually is freedom. Ignatius just likes to use the word indifference. So he likes to say freedom from disordered attachment brings about freedom for the magis. Remember, we talked about freedom from the negative influence on the past, on the present, so that we can be for. Well, Ignatius uses this term disordered attachments, and I'll just real quick explain what that means. So the attachment is to a thing, right? Or to a person, or to an aspect of our personality, or to a role. You know how we talked about finding God in all things?
Yes.
Well, the attachment can be to anything. And he talks about it as being disordered. And the order, for Ignatius, there's a proper order. God, self, and others, and the goods of creation. So that's the proper order. Now Ignatius says it becomes disorder when, and we saw this in the two standards, when the self comes before God, or the goods of, so there's a disorder that comes about. And so indifference is freedom from these disordered attachments, or putting our lives in the proper order, so that we're free to do what God desires us to do in our life, to do God's will, to know God's will and to do God's will. And Jesus is the source of true indifference, and it's the freedom required of generosity. Indifference is the freedom of the true self. Ignatius guides the retreatants to choose the magis through indifference, so that the desire to serve Jesus and attach themselves totally to Jesus. So the idea is, and we'll see this in the three types of persons especially, but to let go of everything and be free of it in this life, so that we're attached only to Jesus. And that's that abiding state of union with God, you know. That's what you taste when you're on that spiritual high, is that attachment to Jesus. So the strategy of Christ reveals the magis, and it empowers indifference. So Ignatius then talks about three classes of persons. This meditation precedes the contemplation on the public life of Jesus. Three classes of person deals with disordered or inordinate attachments, like we just talked about there, that impair the activation of our grace desires, or the activation of the true self. Whatever blocks one openness to Christ's program of love and responsibility, and whatever stifles the true self, is an attachment that's disordered. Disordered attachments narrow our vision and cloud our perception, so it becomes difficult to activate the true self. The three classes of persons meditation is about detachment from everything that impedes our movement towards God and towards that intimacy with the indwelling Spirit of God that we talked about last week, or last month. So the key is to consider this meditation from the viewpoint of indifference. The challenge of choosing as someone whose identity is focused on the uniqueness of the magis, the salvation of their soul, or as we've been talking about, the activation of the true self, or the appropriation of the true self. It's a practical application of Christ's way of love and of responsibility in the world. It's a movement from insecurity, fear, and disordered self-love to detachment from all things, so as to become attached only to Christ. So in the exercise, Ignatius suggests some specific type of attachment, and he says, how about a big pile of money? So the individual, in the exercise, you're supposed to imagine yourself have a big sum of money. And it's about how each person struggles to rid themselves of their attachment to the money. So it's something that's a value that's not in the proper order. And Ignatius says, you know, money is the obvious one. Of course, that was his Achilles heel. Money, riches, pride, and I forget the third one. But so the first class of person is sort of the procrastinator. They want to clean up their act and assure their salvation. It wants to get rid of disordered attachments, but tomorrow. But tomorrow.
The rich young man.
That's right. But tomorrow. Hence their attachment to the money just continues to grow. If they don't go against the disorder, it becomes all-encompassing. There are a lot of talk, but no action. And it often surfaces as if only dreaming. If only I went and gave everything and worked to the poor, then I could give these riches away. But since I'm slotted into this part of life, I have to stay attached to the riches. At the hour of their death, they still have disordered attachments. And they remain afraid of the immeasurable love of God. Yeah, remain afraid of the immeasurable love of God. So that first class of person is like St. Augustine when he said, cure me of my ill desires, but oh, not yet, oh, not yet. The second class of person is the compromiser. They rationalize their use of the money. They want the best of both worlds. They want to have their money and they want to have the intimacy with Christ. But it's a self-willed decision as to how they're going to realize the love of God. So another way of looking at it, it's instead of God's will, God's way, it's God's will, their way, or the individual's way. And they want to make a deal so that they don't have to give up the money. See, they lack that indifference. They lack the detachment. A keen sense of awareness of attachment to the money, but will not do the one thing necessary to grow in intimacy with God. Detach and grow in indifference. So the second class of person, like the first class of person, struggles to activate the true self. And neither the first or the second type of person is able to do the magis, or the greater glory of God. The third class of person is free and indifferent. And that's what we're calling the true self, huh? They don't actually give up the money, but they are detached from it. So things are in the proper order. They seek only to will and not will as God inspires them to do. Desire only to be free to what God wants them to do. So the focus is upon God and not themselves. So they're God-focused in everything that they think and want and do. So the third type of person makes an effort to break the disordered attachment to the money, constantly renews their experience of the love of God, and grapples seriously with the alternatives, keeping or getting rid of the money, but moves to indifference once the decision's made. That includes freedom from riches and freedom for actual poverty. In and through indifference, the magis can be known and chosen. The third type of person is free to hear God's call to the magis and respond. And here's the key: when it's clearly known. The response to the magis of the third type of person is a surrender to what's clearly known of what God is doing and inviting and acting in that individual's life. So, do you have any reflections or questions about the three types of persons?
I think that's fantastic, important, because that's how you can live in this day and age, because you can kind of all the things that you're going to do in any particular day or any big project that you're going to involve yourself with, is to pray on it and to say, what is God wanting me to do about this? Why am I being called to do this? And you always get an answer. I mean, not right away, but necessarily, but you always get an answer. And that's because, in a sense, that's what you're doing. You're putting it in the right order. You're saying, I understand the money. I understand, that I need to function a certain way. People are depending on me to do certain things. And then I pray to God, Jesus, or the Trinity, to say, okay, is this the right thing for me to do? And you'll get an answer. I'm speaking for myself, but I've found that in other people too. So when they're struggling with something, it's because they're struggling with allowing God to tell them this particular thing you're doing isn't really something that you need to be doing. Or the evil one is using it. In other words, let's say it seems like a good thing to do, but it's not really the good thing to do right now, and that isn't really what brings you closer to the Majas. And that's how I seem to feel. And it's only in recent years, since I've done the 19th annotation, and then follow on and follow on and follow on, that I have been able to live my life that way. And now it's pretty much all that way.
Isn't that wonderful?
And it's terrific, because somebody is asking me to do whatever it is. I stop and I think, is this really something that how is this going to fit in with my goal of living my life doing everything that I do, I want to be doing what you want me to do now. And it helps.
Focus being on God.
Absolutely.
And what God wants.
When I go to the hospitals and I go visit the people in the hospitals, same routine. When I go teach the, 5th grade boys, same routine. In a sense.
Right.
And then all the studying that I do. If I'm studying and pursuing a particular path, like I've got a significant interest currently in Buddha and Buddhism, and how Buddhism fits and supplements Christianity. And then if I find myself getting too drawn into the Buddhist thing, I just back away from it.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. It feels pretty good.
That's great.
Attachment's hard though, isn't it?
It's so hard.
Yeah.
It's so hard. Yeah. It's so hard.
And then how do you know if it's detachment or if it's a genuine need? Don't.
Talk a little bit more about that.
I mean, you could say that, like you gave the example of money. But money could also be a need.
Yes. Yeah, it can be anything that you put before God. Unless it's an organic human need.
I'm getting lost in this.
Okay.
Maybe I need to do this over again.
No.
These exercises over again.
No.
I understand the example that you gave, but I also feel that, as long as you're not putting it before God,
Right.
it's not.
Then it's in proper order
Okay.
and you're detached from it.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, because we all have human needs. That's what I mean about
you're right,
organic
that's right,
needs.
right.
We all,
Thoughts are spinning and I'm not putting them in the right order. Okay.
okay.
All right.
Well, you got it.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So the last exercises of the second week are the 3 degrees of humility. And another way to look at that is three ways of loving God. And it's concerned with our relationship to the person of Christ. And these 3 dispositions are necessary to become united with Christ and to activate the true self. So there are 3 different ways of being. And that's where I get back to that first question that you asked about how different times of your life it feels different. Just be aware of the subtle differences as we move through each type of humility or each type of love of God. Because these are 3 stages of love of Christ. Our lives are a mixture of these 3 degrees, and God decides which degree must be practiced when, depending on the context and the reality that we're facing. Expansion of the freedom of indifference comes with the grace and the desire to be with and to suffer with Christ. We learn that the true self can grow into identifying with Jesus in his way of contempt and insult and foolishness. So it's 3 different levels, and the highest is, for Ignatius, growing in Jesus' way of contempt, insult, and foolishness. But we'll see why that is in just a bit. So the first type of humility, it's necessary for salvation. It assumes obedience to God. It doesn't desire to do anything that separates from God. So that attachment, that bond remains there. Will never violate their conscience. Eternal salvation is so important that no reward, nothing, however pleasurable, would entice you to offend the beloved, who is Jesus. And serious commitment of love, but does not properly order one's life unconditionally to the will of God. So there's still some disorder going on in the first type of person. So that true self is still not fully activated. Second type of humility builds on the first, but Ignatius says it's more perfect. It's adequate for discernment and decision making. And here we see the true self starting to come into life and come into being. And so Ignatius writes, I do not desire or feel myself strongly attached to having wealth rather than poverty, honor rather than dishonor, or a long life rather than a short one. That's an echo of the first principle and foundation that we read right before the first week. Right, and take it all. And that not desiring one or the other, that's the indifference that Ignatius is trying to tease out, that profound freedom. So in the second type of humility, one's daily life is ordered to great virtue. Sights are set on one thing, God alone. And love enables the capacity to read the implicit, unstated desires of the beloved. So there's this intuitional kind of knowing. In the mystical tradition, they call it infused contemplation, where the will of God is just sort of known. And I think, Tom, you were sort of reflecting upon that a little bit from your own experience, that you know, you ask and yet there's this sort of knowing there of what the right decision is to make. And the second degree of humility is, it presumes the freedom of indifference, because beyond avoiding evil, there's a pervasive desire to know and do the majas. And so the focus of life is doing the greater glory of God and the salvation of one's soul. Or, as we've been talking about, the activation of the true self, the appropriation of the true self. Ignatius says the third type of humility is the most perfect. It's rooted in a heartfelt desire to imitate Christ And that's the key, to imitate Christ by the full embrace of the indwelling Spirit of God. Attitude of the heart in our personal relationship with Christ that presupposes the first two. So the third degree builds on the first degree of the humility and the second degree of humility. And depending on the context of life, we move in and out of the three. Person with the third type of humility, or the most perfect love, desires to walk no other path than that of following the unconditional love of Jesus. The choice to totally give one's life to be with Jesus. And the willingness, which is a grace, to suffer with Jesus. And the accent here is with Jesus and not for Jesus or because of Jesus. It's a free choice to suffer with Jesus. It's the imitation of Christ marked by the desire to share their whole being in the condition of Christ. Contempt, ridicule, and being misunderstood are the condition of Christ when he lived in this world. And that's what the third degree aspires to do. To share those conditions so that we are more deeply united with Christ. So it's not suffering for suffering's sake, but it's suffering because it brings us into a deeper, more full intimacy with Jesus. Does that make sense?
But Jesus just suffered. No, wait a minute. Jesus didn't suffer for the sake of suffering. He did what was right, and that caused him suffering.
Right. And so this third degree is that you'll follow that way of doing what's right and good. And
You'll end up
There you
having-
go.
and there you go.
You'll end up having some suffering.
I think you get the punchline.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Yeah, but again, it's not for suffering's sake. It's suffering so that that intimacy of that bond develops. Because you can't suffer without the grace of God. You know, without God, we're nothing. So beyond indifference to preferring actual poverty over wealth, contempt over honors, and to be even a useless fool for Christ. That's my favorite. To be a useless fool for Christ. These things emerge freely out of union with God. So it's not my own ego that's wanting to do these things, but it's God's movement in me, that I'm so free, I'm willing to be a fool for Christ.
So let me ask you something.
Sure.
So Jesus as man did all those things, but he did it with the Father, which made him divine. I'm getting into problem.
Getting into a little Christology.
Yeah, I know. And that's it. So he showed us what to do, but whereas did you see the movie The Shack?
No, I
Did you read The
didn't.
Shack?
No.
Because in that, God as Father had the wounds in his hand, saying that I suffered too. It wasn't just Jesus on the cross. So in other
Oh,
words,
interesting.
Christ, God drew his strength from the Father,
Definitely.
and that we are to draw our strength through the Son.
Right.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
That's what
exactly.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
It takes me a while to, it's all up here, I just have a hard time getting it out.
Well, you did well there.
Okay. It was more of a question, so, yeah, okay.
Yeah. No, I think you're right on. The way to his Father is through the Son. You know. And so this call to insults or poverty, it's the freedom to accept these states because of one's intimacy with Christ in order to do the magis, because it will bring about a deeper salvation of our soul or activate the true self. And it's dependent upon certain conditions and therefore cannot be put into practice at all places and all times. Like it says, it has seasons of your life bring about things, and God invites you into these, the God's with you in it.
So that means all things in the seasons of your life can draw you closer to God.
Oh, absolutely.
Because sometimes you just feel like you're in that,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't feel that way.
Right.
Desolation. It doesn't feel that way, but, and all you want to do is get out of that paper bag.
Uh-huh. What's stopping you? That would be the question, huh?
Well, it's life, you know? Life's got you stuck somewhere sometimes, so
Mhm.
that you can't, you're struggling where you're at. Just trying to find answers.
But is God there in the struggle?
Yes, but he doesn't feel like he's there in the struggle.
Okay.
Yes, I know he's there,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't feel like he's there.
Right. And that's some of the suffering of the third type of humility, I think, is that absence of God. But I think the challenge is, even in the darkness and the fog, to stay attached to Christ. You know, to hold on to Christ and not give in to the strategy of the evil one.
Well, you know, where do you go? There isn't a place to go.
Right.
You know, you can be as angry as a hornet at God, but where are you going to go?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
You know, it's like being a kid. My example of being a child and being angry at your parents. But there's something that, from my experience, that I knew they loved me, and even though they were causing all this frustration with me,
Mm-hmm.
because I wasn't getting my way, which is life, sometimes you don't get your way. Where do you go?
Just to God.
Yeah. It's just
Yeah, it's a surrender.
but it's in
to Him.
knowing that, it's in being in that space, it's knowing that God doesn't leave you and that God's going somewhere with this. You know,
Mhm.
you're not, it's hard sometimes.
That's why they call it faith rather than
Yeah.
knowledge.
It's just really hard sometimes.
It is hard. It is hard. This
He
path is a
certainly
hard
doesn't treat
path.
his friends very
Aw.
well.
What does Teresa say about that? If this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so
few of them. Who said that? Mother Teresa?
I don't know if it was, I think it was Teresa the Little Flower that.
Oh, okay.
One of them who was on a horse or something, fell off the horse and, fell in the mud or whatever, and looked up to God and said, "This is the way you treat your friends." I'm wondering so few.
Right. It is a struggle. So the second week is really to try and foster that intimate love relationship with Christ. And so these exercises are just meditations that help you to grow in self-awareness of where you are. You know, which type of person are you acting out of right now? The first type that's the procrastinator, the second type that's the negotiator, or that third type that's free and surrendered and indifferent? Which degree of humility is God asking you to live out in your life at this particular time? You know, if it's a time of suffering, then is that suffering united with Christ so that it's generative and life-giving suffering rather than death-dealing suffering? So the point is that the second week is not just a week of the exercises, but it's a way of life. It's the walk of the disciple to grow into union with God by bringing about that true self that labors within each and every one of our beings, so that we can bring to life Christ. So we become, like I started with this lecture, we become Christ.
That's an interesting thing. Since you said that, you know, I've been trying to, every time I receive the Eucharist, I thank God for becoming part of me and me becoming part of Him. And then I do that every single day, and I begin to feel really that's happening.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's simple enough thing, but if you want to be like Christ, you have to just allow yourself, allow Him to be part of you. And when you receive the Eucharist, He is physically part of you. And you physically are part of Him.
And that communion becomes union.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And then when you read the varying New Testament Gospels, you can almost like open a page and say, how am I going to be like Christ today? What did He do? You don't have to like go to the Matthew 5 Beatitudes, but you can go to anyone. You can say, this is what He was doing. This is how He's getting the message across. Like He had His followers, and His followers were not the brightest lights in the world to start with. And He had to keep coming up with ways of trying to get the message across, and He finally did in the end. But send them out to do fishing, and well, we were out fishing all night. We didn't catch anything. Well, go out and put your net over the other side and see what happens. Or let him be out in the storm and he comes walking across the water. It's like a real message.
Yeah, that doesn't get it home. I don't know what would.
Here's an interesting thing to do sometimes. Is you can sit with a group of people and it's why do you believe what you believe? So if you just take the creed and you start with little parts of the creed, I believe in God. Well, what do you believe? Each person, tell me, what is your experience? Why you believe in God? Oh man, you told me that when I was in school. Very infrequently do you get, well, I feel God. And that's what you want. You want to feel God.
Yeah.
And when you get an answer to a prayer, it's not, you don't get the answer to the prayer in words, you get the answer to the prayer like, it's like it got infused in your brain.
Yeah. Like an infused contemplation, like the mystics talk about.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it's so hard with everyday life. In everyday life, to be able to say, I am following that order. I'm putting my efforts away with God as my guide, God bringing me closer to God. And so what if it takes a lifetime? And it's interesting when you've been, and I'm sure you have, when you're accompanying somebody at the end of their life, you can see the people that did that. They're perfectly at ease.
At peace, yeah.
Peace. And then you see other people.
Or absolutely panicked.
Right.
Yeah.
They could jump out of their skins, they would. You see it in their eyes.
Just another thought. Well, that's the end of the lecture.
All right.
Thank you both for coming this evening.
Thanks, good. I spoke to Buddy, and he had to go to some kind of a board meeting.
Yeah, that's what he said. He shot me an email today.
Yeah, so I said, well, listen, Buddy, I hope you're bringing Catholic social teaching to your board.
He has a big board today. We had an executive conference call for our board today too, and he's on that.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh.
So,
Is that for Ignatian spirituality?
yeah,
Yeah.
the center.
He's a good guy.
He is a good guy.
He's a very good guy.
Is that the guy who's,
Yeah. Guy who sat here last time.
he reminds me of my uncle.
Does he?
And when you know what he did in his business life, it's like so far different.
Yeah, was it in PR or something?
No, he's a lawyer.
Oh, he's a lawyer.
Yeah, and he was a lawyer in a firm that did a lot of acquisitions, and the guy that he worked for was like a merciless guy,
Oh, really?
and he just survived in that setting, you know.
Oh, wow.
It would almost be like being a lawyer for Donald Trump. You know, it was like
Oh, jeez.
very,
That would be pretty bad.
Right. So, you know, he and I got to know each other because when he started the program to become a spiritual director, I went in that program too. So we were away in North Carolina the first year, and we got to know each other even better there. And then he was very, 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 very deeply involved in helping out. He was helping out when this building was being
Renovated.
renovated, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and Father Fitzpatrick has kind of steered him in one of many different directions.
Yeah.
But he's good.
It seems like everybody that goes to be a spiritual director, that's where they really delve into this stuff. Much more than somebody who's done the exercises. Am I guessing that
Did you do
correct?
the 19th annotation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, well, when you study to be a spiritual director, you get more of the categorical knowledge, whereas it's more contemplative knowledge when you do the 19th annotation.
Yeah, but I guess that you know, like after you get off the Curcio weekend, you have a community. That's the part that's basically why I'm here, is because I feel, you know, maybe among people that study to be spiritual directors, there's a certain community. But doesn't seem like there's that for people who have,
Right.
you know.
That's what we're trying to figure out how to do, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
This was one shot,
Yeah.
giving these lectures, but
Yeah.
you know, it's the exercises are such an individualized process. But then how do you grow that out to be a community? Like I'm directing a guy in the exercises now, and he said to me, "Do I ever get to meet other people who are doing this?" Like, well, maybe after you're done, but you don't really meet in groups. So I don't think you're alone in that.
Yeah. And I just, you know, because I mean, here we are at Fairfield University, you gotta be able to find something like this, where there's people that, because I've kind of like outgrown the Curcio thing.
Yeah.
And but I still feel that sense that you want something that, where people are like-minded, where you can grow together and you can, you know, like this is great. I love this stuff.
Well, thank
You
you.
can talk to me I can do this every week, because how else are you going to grow in what you're, you know, I mean, I can read it, but there's something to be said about somebody teaching you too, and going through all that, yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I don't know, maybe I should just do the exercises all over again. I don't know if that's,
How long ago?
I don't know, I was trying to think, it's probably been a while. I I meant to look last time and I couldn't.
One of the things that I think they were thinking about doing is, and I don't know where it went, but the group that I was with in North Carolina, when we were there, and that's several years ago, we decided that we would meet here monthly, once a month, right? Typically we meet at 1 o'clock it's a Friday, usually the second Friday of the month, and we meet downstairs in Egan Chapel, right? Small group, and we do something that's called holy listening.
Oh yeah.
Right? And the holy
Yeah,
listening.
they did that before too at one of these things.
Did they?
They showed you, yeah. The
Holy
spiritual
listening
directors
is
did it.
good when you
I thought that was wonderful.
when you get into it, because you hear what other people are hearing. You know, they're familiar with how it goes around.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
So a group like that of how many people? There's a fair number of people right here on the university grounds who did the exercises.
Mm-hmm. And there's about 30.
And they all have jobs that they're doing, but you could maybe conceivably get them away during the day, weekday, for an hour or two. You don't have to, like we don't serve anything, food or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
And typically we meet at 1 o'clock and we're finished at 2:30, something like that. And they were even talking about, because they're all going to graduate now, the group that I'm with.
Right.
They allowed me, I'm the only one that's in the group that's not becoming a spiritual director.
Okay.
But anyway, they said, well, should we keep on doing this after we graduate? And they all want to do it. Yeah, well, let's keep doing it. Let's keep doing it. And somebody comes from New Jersey,
Oh wow.
drives over here.
That's a long
There's a
ride.
guy from way up in Granby or someplace like way up in upstate Connecticut, almost to Massachusetts. He drives down. And not everybody can come every single month.
Sure.
It's an idea.
I even like being with those that have been like the spiritual directors, because they have that knowledge, and listening to them talk, because it stretches me, it helps me learn. And I understand people are in all different places, but I want something that's going to stretch me, to help me grow and to understand more and to get somewhere instead of being stagnant where I'm at. Sometimes.
Are you in spiritual direction now? Do you go to any?
Yes. But I don't know. I just like this. You want to do this next month? I'll be here.
Thanks.
But anyhow, that's just my opinion. But I really enjoyed it. Like I said,